Racist cop arrests. Black man in park, then learns. He's the chief of police. The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees lining Riverside Park, carrying with it the earthy scent of fallen leaves and the distant echoes of children's laughter from the playground. Officer James Carter drummed his fingers against the steering wheel of his patrol car, his weathered face reflecting years of what he called street wisdom, but what others might label as something far less charitable. The dashboard clock read 2:17 p.m., and he was halfway through another shift that felt like it was dragging on forever. If you love your family and these kinds of videos, subscribe now and join us for more heartwarming moments. Carter's eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, a habit formed over 15 years of police work. The park had always been his favorite patrol spot, not because of its scenic beauty or the peaceful atmosphere, but because he prided himself on his ability to spot what he called irregularities. His colleagues often praised his intuition, though none dared to question the foundation of these supposed insights. As his cruiser crawled past the newly renovated fountain, something caught his attention. A man sat alone on one of the park benches, dressed in what appeared to be an expensive charcoal gray suit. The man's presence itself wasn't unusual. Plenty of professionals from nearby offices often took their lunch breaks in the park. What made Carter's internal alarm bells ring was something he couldn't quite articulate. The man was black, and while Carter would vehemently deny any racial prejudice if asked, his subconscious had already begun constructing a narrative. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, with a clean-shaven face and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an intellectual air. He was reading something on his tablet, occasionally making notes with what looked like a high-end stylus. A leather briefcase sat beside him, and a paper coffee cup steamed gently on the bench. Everything about the scene spoke of normalcy, of a professional taking a moment of respite in his day. Yet Carter felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation he'd come to associate with what he called his cop instincts. He pulled the cruiser to a stop, watching the man through his side mirror. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the park, and Carter observed how other park goers, mostly white, gave the man a wide berth as they passed, though the man himself seemed either unaware or deliberately choosing to ignore these subtle social dynamics. Carter's mind began constructing scenarios. Maybe the suit was stolen. Maybe this was some sort of setup for a drug deal. Maybe the tablet contained sensitive information obtained illegally. The rational part of his brain tried to interrupt these thoughts, pointing out their absurdity. But 15 years of unchecked biases had built strong walls around Carter's perspective. He'd made similar stops countless times before, and while most had led nowhere, the few times his hunches had paid off had only reinforced his prejudices. Carter stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt with practiced authority. The leather of his holster creaked as he moved, a sound that had become almost comforting over the years. He approached the bench with measured steps, his boots crunching against the fallen leaves. The man didn't look up immediately, engrossed in whatever he was reading on his tablet. "Afternoon," Carter announced, his voice carrying that particular tone that police officers develop over years of service, a mixture of authority and forced casualness that often preceded trouble. The man looked up, his expression neutral but alert. Carter noticed the expensive watch on his wrist, the quality of his suit's tailoring, and the way he sat, straight-backed and composed. "Good afternoon, officer," the man replied, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that somehow irritated Carter. "Is there something I can help you with?" The question was perfectly polite, yet Carter felt challenged by its directness. He shifted his weight, adopting what he considered his most authoritative stance. "Mind telling me what brings you to this part of the park today?" The man's eyebrows rose slightly, but his composure remained intact. "I wasn't aware this part of the park had restricted access," he said, gesturing to the public space around them. "I'm taking a break from work, enjoying the weather." Carter's jaw tightened. There was something about the man's calm demeanor that felt like defiance. "I'm going to need to see some identification," he said, making it clear this wasn't a request. The man, who would soon introduce himself as Sam, set his tablet down carefully, his movements deliberate and measured. "May I ask why you need to see my identification, officer?" Sam's question was posed quietly, but there was an underlying strength in his voice that made Carter's pulse quicken with irritation. "I'm simply sitting here, breaking no laws that I'm aware of." Carter felt heat rising in his neck. This was usually the point where people simply complied, where his authority went unquestioned. "Sir, when an officer requests identification, you're required to provide it," he stated, conveniently overlooking the actual legal requirements for such requests. Sam maintained eye contact, his gaze steady and unafraid. "Officer," he began, his tone remaining respectful but firm, "I believe you're aware that's not entirely accurate. You need reasonable suspicion that I've committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime to demand identification. Have I done something to arouse such suspicion?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Carter felt his professional mask slipping, replaced by something more personal, more raw. He'd stopped countless people over the years, and few had ever questioned his authority so directly, so eloquently. The fact that Sam was doing so while maintaining perfect composure only served to heighten Carter's agitation. "Listen here," Carter began, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that he'd developed over years of similar encounters. "I'm not here to debate law with you. This is a high-crime area, and I'm conducting a routine check." The lie about the crime rate rolled off his tongue easily. The park was actually in one of the safest neighborhoods in the city. Sam's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something, not fear, but perhaps resignation, crossing his features. He reached slowly for his briefcase, his movements deliberately telegraphed. "Officer Carter," he said, reading the name badge, "I want to be clear that I'm complying under protest. I believe this stop is unauthorized and potentially discriminatory." The word discriminatory hit Carter like a physical blow, though he maintained his stern expression. He watched as Sam carefully opened his briefcase, noting the organized contents within: files, a laptop, business cards in a silver case. Everything spoke of professionalism and success, things that somehow made Carter even more suspicious rather than less. A young couple walked past, slowing their pace to observe the interaction. Carter noticed them whispering to each other, the woman pulling out her phone in a way that suggested she might start recording. His discomfort grew, but he was too committed to back down now. Sam produced a wallet from his briefcase, expensive leather like everything else he owned. He opened it slowly, removing his ID with careful precision. Carter snatched it from his hand more roughly than necessary, studying the credentials with narrow eyes. The park had grown quieter, or perhaps it just seemed that way to Carter as he read the information on the ID. Samuel Jefferson, the address in one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. The photo matched perfectly, and everything about the ID seemed legitimate, which only served to frustrate Carter more. "This address," Carter said, his tone still dismissive. "You live in Oakwood Heights." The disbelief in his voice was clear, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a mistake. The implication hung in the air like smoke. "Yes, Officer Carter, I do," Sam replied, his voice carrying a weight that made Carter shift uncomfortably. "I've lived there for the past 3 years. Is there something about that address that concerns you?" More people had stopped to watch now, their presence forming a loose circle around the scene. Carter could feel their eyes on him, hear the murmur of their conversations. Someone was definitely recording now. He could see the raised phones in his peripheral vision. "Well, you can understand why I might find it unusual," Carter pressed on, digging himself deeper. "A man like you in that neighborhood? A man like me," Sam interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that could cut steel. "Please, Officer Carter, elaborate on what you mean by that." Carter felt sweat forming at his temples despite the cool autumn air. He knew he should stop, knew he was walking into dangerous territory, but something in him couldn't back down. Years of unchallenged authority and biased assumptions had created a momentum he couldn't seem to break. "Listen here," Carter began again, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his belt near his handcuffs. "I don't appreciate your attitude. You need to understand that when an officer—" "No, Officer Carter," Sam cut in, his voice now carrying an authority that made Carter blink in surprise. "I believe you need to understand something. Your actions right now are being observed and recorded by multiple citizens. You've stopped me without reasonable suspicion, made implications about my presence in an affluent neighborhood, and are now attempting to intimidate me for simply asking about my rights. Would you like to continue down this path?" The gathered crowd had grown larger, and Carter could hear snippets of their conversations, none of them favorable to his position. His collar felt tight, and the weight of his badge, usually a comfort, now felt like it was burning against his chest. But pride and ingrained prejudice were powerful forces, and Carter found himself unable to simply walk away from what he'd started. "Sir, step away from the bench," Carter ordered, his voice carrying a tremor he hoped others couldn't hear. "Place your hands where I can see them." Sam's eyes met his, and for a moment, Carter saw something in them that made him deeply uncomfortable. Not fear or anger, but a kind of knowing sadness, as if he'd been through this many times before and knew exactly how it would end. Sam rose from the bench with a deliberate grace that somehow made Carter feel even more agitated. His movements were smooth and precise, hands raised to shoulder height, making it clear to everyone watching that he posed no threat. The tablet and briefcase remained on the bench. Expensive items left vulnerable in a way that spoke volumes about their owner's confidence. The crowd had grown denser now, forming a loose semicircle around the scene. The autumn wind carried whispers and the occasional sharp comment, along with the distinctive sounds of smartphone camera shutters. Carter felt the weight of each lens trained on him, each witness becoming another pressure point in an already tense situation. "Officer Carter," Sam spoke, his voice carrying across the now quiet park. "I want to be clear about what's happening here. You've stopped me without cause, and now you're escalating the situation despite my full cooperation. I'd like you to articulate, for the record and these witnesses, what crime you suspect me of committing." The request was reasonable, too reasonable, and that made it dangerous. Carter felt the familiar surge of defensive anger rising in his chest. Throughout his career, he'd relied on a certain script for these encounters: authority questioned, authority enforced, compliance achieved. But Sam wasn't following the script, and worse, he was forcing Carter to confront the hollow core of his actions in front of an increasingly hostile audience. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Carter ordered, his voice carrying a brittleness that hadn't been there before. He reached for his handcuffs, the metal catching the afternoon sun. The crowd's murmuring grew louder, more insistent. Sam didn't move immediately. Instead, he maintained eye contact with Carter, his expression a complex mixture of disappointment and resolution. "Officer, I want to be clear that I'm complying under protest, and I'm memorizing the badge number displayed on your uniform. I expect this interaction to be thoroughly reviewed by your superiors." A young woman in the crowd called out, "I've got it all on video, sir." "Every second." Others nodded in agreement, phones still raised. Carter felt his professional facade cracking under the weight of their collective judgment, but he was too far committed to change course now. Sam turned slowly, movements still measured and deliberate. Carter approached with his handcuffs ready, trying to ignore the dozens of eyes watching his every move. As he reached for Sam's wrist, he noticed the man's watch again, a Patek Philippe that probably cost more than Carter made in a year. The sight of it somehow made him angrier, though he couldn't quite articulate why. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that seemed unnecessarily loud in the tense atmosphere. Carter noticed that Sam's suit jacket was perfectly tailored, the fabric expensive and smooth under his fingers. Everything about the man spoke of success and refinement, Qualities that should have set Carter at ease, but instead provoked a deep-seated discomfort he wasn't ready to examine. "Is this really necessary, Officer Carter?" Sam asked, his voice low enough that only Carter could hear. "Think carefully about what happens next. There's still time to make a different choice." The warning was clear, but Carter's pride wouldn't let him back down. "Stop resisting," he said loudly, though Sam hadn't moved a muscle. It was a phrase he'd used countless times before, a verbal shield meant to justify whatever came next. "I'm not resisting, officer," Sam replied, his voice pitched to carry to the crowd. "I'm complying fully while reserving my right to question the legality of this detention. Would anyone watching please continue to record?" More phones raised in response, and Carter heard someone say they were live streaming. The situation was spinning beyond his control. But like a man caught in quicksand, his instincts to struggle only seemed to sink him deeper. "You have the right to remain silent," Carter began, reciting the Miranda rights with mechanical precision. The words felt hollow in his mouth, a procedural shield that was doing nothing to protect him from the reality of his actions. "I'm aware of my rights," Sam interrupted calmly. "I'm also aware that this stop violated several departmental policies and constitutional protections. I'd like you to call your supervisor to the scene immediately." The request was reasonable, which made it all the more infuriating. Carter's hand moved to his radio, hesitating. Making that call would be admitting that the situation had escalated beyond his control, but refusing would only make things worse. A child's voice pierced the tension. "Mommy, why is that police officer putting the man in handcuffs? He was just sitting there." The innocent question carried clearly across the now silent park, and Carter felt his face grow hot. The child's mother whispered something in response, her disapproving gaze fixed firmly on Carter. The crowd had swollen to nearly 30 people now, their presence forming a wall of silent judgment. Carter noticed a few faces he recognized, regular parkgoers, local business owners, even a city council member's aide. Each witness added another layer of complexity to a situation that had already spiraled far beyond a simple, routine check. "Officer," Sam spoke again, his voice steady despite the handcuffs. "I'm going to make a simple request, and I want you to consider it carefully. Call your station, verify my identity. I believe it will save us both considerable time and trouble." There was something in his tone that made Carter pause. Not a threat, exactly, but a certainty that suggested he knew something Carter didn't. The crowd seemed to lean in collectively, sensing a shift in the dynamic. Carter's radio felt heavy on his shoulder. His training had covered many scenarios, but nothing quite like this. The man in handcuffs was simultaneously the most compliant and most challenging suspect he'd ever encountered. Every attempt to assert authority had been met with calm resistance, backed by an apparently thorough knowledge of police procedure and constitutional law. A breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sound of distant sirens. Carter couldn't tell if they were heading this way, but the sound added another layer of urgency to the situation. His hand moved to his radio again, this time with purpose. "Dispatch," he spoke, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is Officer Carter at Riverside Park. I need to run an ID check." He paused, looking at Sam's driver's license again. Last name, Jefferson. First name, Samuel. Dub, 03 of 15 to 1978. The radio crackled with static, and Carter noticed Sam's slight smile. It wasn't smug or triumphant. If anything, it carried a hint of sadness, as if he'd hoped things wouldn't have to go this far. "Stand by." The dispatcher's voice came back, professional but with an undercurrent of something Carter couldn't quite identify. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. The crowd had grown quieter, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Carter became acutely aware of every detail of the scene. The way the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, the gentle sway of the trees, the reflection of his own tense expression in Sam's glasses. "Officer Carter," the dispatcher's voice returned, now carrying a distinctly different tone. There was a formality there that made Carter's stomach tighten. "Please verify your location." "Riverside Park, main path near the fountain," Carter replied, his mouth suddenly dry. Another pause, shorter this time but somehow heavier. "A standby for Sergeant Phillips." The mention of the sergeant made Carter's heart rate spike. Something was very wrong. He looked at Sam again. Really looked at him this time, trying to see what he'd missed before. Sam met his gaze steadily. "Officer Carter," he said quietly, "I believe things are about to become very complicated for you. I want you to know that what happens next will depend largely on how you handle the next few minutes." The radio crackled again, and Sergeant Phillips's voice came through, clear and clipped. "Officer Carter, release Mr. Jefferson immediately. He is—" There was a pause that seemed to carry the weight of Carter's entire career. "Your new chief of police." The words hit Carter like a physical blow. The crowd, which had grown silent to hear the radio exchange, erupted in a mixture of gasps and murmurs. Someone laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound that cut through the tension like a knife. Carter's hands moved to the handcuffs automatically, his fingers fumbling with the keys. The metal suddenly felt burning hot against his skin. Every second that Sam, Chief Jefferson, remained restrained, another nail in the coffin of his career. As the handcuffs came off, Carter noticed his hands were shaking. The chief rolled his shoulders slightly, adjusting his suit jacket with the same calm deliberation he'd shown throughout the entire encounter. The red marks on his wrists stood out starkly against his skin, a damning testament to Carter's actions. The crowd had begun to move closer, their phones still recording, but now with an added energy. They'd just witnessed something extraordinary, a moment of poetic justice that would likely be viral before sunset. Carter could already imagine the headlines, the social media posts, the departmental review that would inevitably follow. Chief Jefferson turned to face him, straightening his tie with precise movements. The same quiet authority that had irritated Carter earlier now seemed overwhelming in its significance. This man wasn't just another citizen Carter could bully with impunity. He was the new head of the entire department. And Carter had just given him a front-row demonstration of everything wrong with modern policing. The light had shifted in the park, the late afternoon sun casting longer shadows across the gathered crowd. Chief Jefferson stood before Carter, the weight of authority now properly settled on his shoulders, though he'd carried it invisibly all along. The silence that followed the radio announcement was absolute, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of traffic. Carter's mind raced through the events of the last hour, each moment now tainted with a new, horrifying significance. Every dismissive word, every assumption, every abuse of power played back in his memory with crystalline clarity. His throat had gone dry, and the badge that had always felt like a shield now seemed to burn against his chest with accusatory heat. "Officer Carter," Chief Jefferson spoke, his voice carrying easily across the hushed park. "I believe we should continue this discussion at the station." He paused, scanning the crowd with careful consideration. "I want to thank everyone who stayed to witness this incident. Your presence and documentation may prove valuable for the department's ongoing efforts to improve community relations." The words were measured, diplomatic, yet they carried an undercurrent of steel that made Carter wince. Jefferson was already turning this into a teaching moment, demonstrating leadership even as the marks from the handcuffs were still visible on his wrists. A woman in the crowd, middle-aged with graying hair and a teacher's stern expression, stepped forward. "Chief Jefferson," she called out, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. "I've lived here for 20 years, and I've seen Officer Carter do this kind of thing before. Will something actually be done this time?" Jefferson turned to address her directly, his presence commanding yet approachable. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern. I can assure you that what happened here today will be thoroughly addressed. In fact," he paused, adjusting his glasses with deliberate care, It's already serving as a rather pointed example of why I've been brought in to implement comprehensive reforms in the department. Carter felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, each gaze carrying years of accumulated grievances. He'd patrolled this park for over a decade, and now he wondered how many other lives he'd impacted with his routine checks and unfounded suspicions. The realization sat in his stomach like cold lead. "Your phone, Officer Carter," Jefferson said, extending his hand. Carter blinked in confusion before understanding dawned. Department policy requires officers to surrender their devices when involved in incidents under review. I trust you're familiar with the protocol. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The same regulations Carter had so freely ignored earlier were now being turned against him with surgical precision. His hands shook slightly as he handed over his phone, wondering if he'd sent any damning texts during the encounter. Jefferson pocketed the phone smoothly, then retrieved his briefcase from the bench. The tablet he'd been reading earlier was carefully placed inside, along with what Carter now realized must be departmental documents, policies and procedures the chief had been reviewing when Carter had first spotted him. "I've called for a car," Jefferson announced, checking his watch, the expensive timepiece that had earlier fueled Carter's suspicions. "It should be here momentarily. Officer Carter, you'll be riding with me. I believe we have much to discuss." The crowd began to disperse slowly, though many lingered, phones still recording. Carter heard snippets of their conversations, each one a dagger to his professional pride. "Can't believe they let cops like that carry a badge. Did you see how he just assumed? Thank God someone finally caught him in the act." A patrol car pulled up to the park entrance, driven by Officer Rodriguez, who took in the scene with visible confusion. The young officer's eyes widened as he recognized Chief Jefferson, then darted to Carter's ashen face, putting the pieces together with remarkable speed. "Thank you, Officer Rodriguez," Jefferson said as he approached the car. "Please radio Sergeant Phillips and inform him we're en route to the station. Also, make sure the interview room on the second floor is available. Officer Carter and I will need privacy for our discussion." Carter felt his legs move automatically toward the car, years of ingrained obedience overriding his flight instinct. As he reached for the rear door handle, Jefferson's voice stopped him. "Front seat, Officer Carter. This isn't an arrest, though I imagine that distinction means more to you now than it did an hour ago." The observation struck home with devastating accuracy. Carter slid into the front passenger seat, acutely aware of Jefferson settling into the back, his presence filling the car with an authority that had nothing to do with rank or title, and everything to do with the moral high ground he'd maintained throughout the encounter. Rodriguez pulled away from the curb with careful precision, stealing glances at his rearview mirror. The tension in the car was palpable, broken only by the quiet tap of Jefferson's fingers on his tablet as he made notes, documentation that Carter knew would likely feature prominently in whatever came next. The drive to the station seemed both endless and far too short. Carter watched familiar streets pass by, wondering if he'd ever patrol them again. The city looked different now, as if the revelation of Jefferson's identity had stripped away a filter he hadn't known he was seeing through. "Officer Carter," Jefferson spoke suddenly, his voice filling the quiet car. "I want you to understand something. What happened today wasn't just about you or me. It's about a pattern of behavior that's been normalized within law enforcement for far too long." Carter kept his eyes forward, but he could feel Jefferson's gaze on the back of his neck. The chief continued, his words measured and precise. "When I accepted this position, I knew there would be challenges. I've experienced situations like today's before, though usually not quite so dramatically rendered." There was a hint of dry humor in his voice that somehow made it worse. "What I didn't expect was to have such a clear demonstration of the issues we need to address handed to me on my first day in the neighborhood." Rodriguez turned onto the street leading to the station, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Carter realized the young officer was getting an education too, one that would likely shape his entire career. "Sir?" Carter finally managed to speak, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know. That I was the new chief?" Jefferson finished for him. No, you didn't. And that's precisely the problem we need to discuss, because my position shouldn't matter, Officer Carter. The way you treated me today, that shouldn't happen to anyone, regardless of their rank or station in life. The station came into view, its brick facade suddenly looking more imposing than familiar. Several officers were gathered outside, obviously having heard something about what had transpired. Carter recognized faces he'd worked with for years, seeing in their expressions a mixture of curiosity, shock, and in some cases, a recognition that suggested they'd seen this coming. Rodriguez pulled into the chief's reserved parking space, a spot that until recently had been empty pending Jefferson's arrival. The irony of the situation continued to layer itself in ways that would have been almost comical if they weren't so damning. "Officer Rodriguez," Jefferson said as he gathered his briefcase, "thank you for the ride. Please inform Sergeant Phillips that I'll need those files we discussed earlier sent to the interview room." He paused, then added with significant weight, "All of them." Carter's stomach dropped. He knew what those files must be: civilian complaints, incident reports, use of force documentation. His entire career was about to be laid bare, examined through a lens he'd never anticipated. As they walked into the station, the usual bustle of activity slowed to a halt. Officers, dispatchers, and administrative staff all found reasons to be in the lobby, their eyes following the unlikely pair as they made their way to the elevator. Carter felt each gaze like a physical touch, wondering how many of his colleagues were secretly glad to see him in this position. The elevator ride to the second floor was silent, but Carter's mind was anything but quiet. He thought about all the times he'd dismissed complaints against him, all the times superior officers had looked the other way, all the times he'd justified his actions with the same tired excuses about intuition and experience. Jefferson led the way to the interview room, his footsteps echoing in the hushed corridor. As they reached the door, he turned to Carter with an expression that carried both authority and something else, perhaps a hint of hope. "Officer Carter," he said, his voice low enough that only Carter could hear. "What happens next will depend largely on your capacity for honest self-reflection. I don't believe in wasting good officers, but I also don't believe in preserving bad practices. The question is, which are you ready to be?" The door opened to reveal a simple room with a table, chairs, and a stack of files that had somehow already been delivered. Carter recognized his personnel file on top, its thickness a testament to 15 years of service that now felt more like an indictment than an achievement. Jefferson gestured to a chair, and Carter sat, feeling the weight of every decision that had led him to this moment. The chief's earlier words echoed in his mind. Think carefully about what happens next. He hadn't understood the full meaning then, but he did now. This wasn't just about his career. It was about who he was going to choose to be from this moment forward. The interview room's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the scattered files on the table. Chief Jefferson sat across from Carter, his posture relaxed but commanding, as he methodically arranged various documents into precise stacks. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft whisper of paper against paper and the distant murmur of activity from the bullpen outside. Through the room's window blinds, Carter could see officers gathering in small groups, their furtive glances toward the interview room making it clear he was the subject of their discussions. News traveled fast in a police department, and by now, everyone would know about the park incident. He recognized Officer Martinez trying to appear busy at her desk, while obviously straining to hear anything from the interview room. Sergeant Phillips stood by the water cooler, his face a mask of professional concern as he spoke in hushed tones with Lieutenant Brooks. "I see you watching them," Jefferson commented without looking up from the files. "Interesting, isn't it? How quickly the dynamic can change. One moment you're the officer with authority, the next you're the subject of scrutiny." He selected a particular file and opened it with deliberate care. "Tell me, Officer Carter, in your 15 years of service, have you ever been on this side of the table?" Carter shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "No, sir. I've always been the one conducting interviews. Jefferson nodded, scanning the document before him. That's what these records indicate. In fact, they show quite a pattern of you being the one in control. Shall we discuss some of these incidents? Before Carter could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the blinds, they could see several officers crowding around someone's computer screen. The volume of their voices rose enough that fragments of conversation drifted through the door. Already has 50,000 views. Trending on social media. Calling for his badge. Jefferson watched the scene with measured interest. It seems the videos from the park are gaining traction online. I'm not surprised. It was quite a performance we gave them. He turned his attention back to Carter. Though I suspect neither of us was playing the role we anticipated when the day began. Carter's throat felt dry. Sir, about what happened in the park. Yes? Let's talk about what happened in the park, Jefferson interrupted, his voice carrying a weight that made Carter's words die in his throat. But first, I want you to see something. He reached for his tablet, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward Carter. The screen showed a social media feed, already flooding with clips from different angles of their encounter. Some videos started from the beginning, showing Carter's approach to the bench. Others captured the moment of handcuffing. Jefferson's calm dignity a stark contrast to Carter's aggressive posturing. The comments scrolling beneath the videos were a tsunami of public outrage, calls for accountability, and bitter observations about the state of policing. These videos are being shared across multiple platforms, Jefferson explained, his tone professional but pointed. Local news stations have already reached out for comment. City council members are calling my office. The mayor's office has expressed deep concern. He set the tablet down carefully. In less than 2 hours, your actions in the park have become a symbol for everything people fear and resent about law enforcement. Outside, more officers had gathered around the computer screens. Carter recognized faces from other departments. Word was spreading beyond just their precinct. He watched as Detective Harrison, a 20-year veteran known for his unflappable demeanor, shook his head in visible disappointment while watching one of the clips. Your colleagues are seeing you through new eyes, Officer Carter, Jefferson observed. But more importantly, they're seeing themselves, their own potential for similar mistakes. Your actions today may have done more to advance the cause of police reform in this department than a dozen sensitivity training sessions. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sergeant Phillips entered, holding a fresh stack of papers. Chief, these just came in from Internal Affairs. They're requesting an immediate review. He paused, glancing at Carter with an unreadable expression. And, sir, there are several news vans setting up outside the station. Jefferson nodded, accepting the papers. Thank you, Sergeant. Please ensure that all official communications go through the proper channels. No one speaks to the press without clearing it through my office first. As Phillips left, Carter noticed more movement in the bullpen. Officers were hurriedly cleaning up their desks, straightening their uniforms, the universal police response to media presence. The weight of what was happening continued to sink in. This wasn't just a disciplinary issue anymore. It was becoming a public referendum on police conduct, with him as the unwitting centerpiece. You know, Jefferson spoke again, his voice taking on a contemplative tone. When I accepted this position, I reviewed the personnel files of every officer in the department. Yours was interesting reading? He selected another document from the stack before him. Multiple complaints of racial profiling, excessive force allegations, selective enforcement patterns, all dismissed or marked as unfounded after minimal investigation. Carter felt each word like a physical blow. Seeing his career condensed into a list of complaints and incidents stripped away the protective layers of justification he'd built around his actions over the years. But what caught my attention, Jefferson continued, wasn't just the number of complaints. It was the pattern of support you received from superior officers. The way these incidents were consistently downplayed or dismissed. The system didn't just fail the citizens you were meant to protect, it failed you too, by never requiring you to confront the consequences of your actions. Through the window, Carter watched as Officer Rodriguez, who had driven them from the park, was cornered by several colleagues obviously hungry for details about what had happened. The young officer's discomfort was visible as he tried to extract himself from the situation. "Sir," Carter finally managed to speak, "what happens now?" Jefferson leaned back in his chair, studying Carter with the same calm intensity he'd shown in the park. "That's an interesting question. The easy answer would be to recommend immediate termination. The videos provide more than enough justification, and it would certainly satisfy the public's desire for swift action." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But I'm not interested in easy answers, Officer Carter. I'm interested in lasting change." Another knock at the door revealed Lieutenant Brooks, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Chief, the mayor's office is on line 1. They're requesting an immediate statement about the situation." "Tell them I'll return their call within the hour," Jefferson replied without breaking eye contact with Carter. "And Lieutenant, make sure everyone understands that this incident is now part of an ongoing internal investigation. No unofficial discussions, no social media posts, no conversations with anyone outside the department." As Brooks left, Jefferson turned his attention back to the files. "You know, Officer Carter, what happened today isn't just about you anymore. It's become something larger, a moment that crystallizes issues we've been struggling with as a department and as a society." He selected another document, adding it to the growing pile before him. "The question is, are you prepared to be part of the solution, or will you remain part of the problem?" Outside, the afternoon sun had begun to set, casting long shadows through the blinds. The station's routine had been completely disrupted, with officers moving between desks, sharing whispered conversations and worried glances. Through the ground floor windows, Carter could see the growing number of news vans, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like accusatory fingers. "I want you to understand something," Jefferson said, his voice drawing Carter's attention back. "What happens next isn't just about punishment or accountability. It's about transformation of this department, of our approach to policing, and hopefully, of you." He straightened the stack of files with precise movements. "But that transformation will not be easy or comfortable. It will require you to confront things about yourself that you've spent years avoiding." The chief's words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Carter found himself thinking about all the times he'd sat on the other side of tables like this one, confident in his authority, secure in his judgments. Now, seeing it from this perspective, he began to understand just how much power he'd wielded and how carelessly he'd used it. Jefferson checked his watch, the same expensive timepiece that had earlier fueled Carter's suspicions, and made a note in his tablet. "We have decisions to make. Officer Carter. Important ones. But before we do, I want you to spend some time watching those videos. All of them. I want you to see yourself as others see you. Can you do that?" The question wasn't really a question at all, and they both knew it. Carter nodded, his mouth dry, as Jefferson stood and gathered his materials. The chief paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "One more thing, Officer Carter. When you watch those videos, don't just look at yourself. Look at me. Look at my face, my reactions, my composure, and ask yourself, how many others have sat where I sat today, faced what I faced, but didn't have a chief's badge to protect them?" The walk to the chief's office felt like a journey through a gauntlet of silent judgment. Every desk Carter passed, every face he encountered, seemed to carry the weight of what had transpired in the park. The usual bustle of the precinct had been replaced by a tense quiet, broken only by hushed whispers that died as he approached. Chief Jefferson's office, traditionally a symbol of departmental authority, had been transformed in the hours since their return from the park. The space that had sat empty awaiting his arrival now bore subtle but significant changes that spoke to its new occupant's character. The walls, previously adorned with the expected certificates and commendations, now also displayed photographs of civil rights leaders and community engagement initiatives. A worn copy of the Constitution sat prominently on the desk, its pages marked with numerous tabs. Jefferson gestured for Carter to take a seat while he settled behind his desk, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows behind him, creating an almost theatrical backlight. The chief took his time arranging several files before him, each movement deliberate and measured. Carter recognized his personnel file among them, somehow looking thicker than it had in the interview room. "Officer Carter," Jefferson began, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had maintained throughout their encounter. "I've spent the last hour reviewing your complete service record. 15 years with the department, numerous commendations for bravery, above-average arrest records." He paused, selecting a particular document, and a pattern of civilian complaints that, quite frankly, should have raised serious concerns years ago. Carter shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. Through the office windows, he could see the news vans still parked outside, their presence a reminder of how public this internal matter had become. "What interests me most," Jefferson continued, "isn't just the nature of these complaints, but how they were handled. There's a consistent pattern here of superior officers dismissing civilian concerns, of fellow officers closing ranks, of the system protecting itself rather than serving the public." He looked up from the files, fixing Carter with a penetrating gaze. "Tell me, in all your years of service, has anyone ever seriously questioned your methods?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Carter thought back over his career, trying to remember any genuine challenges to his approach. "There were reviews," he offered weakly, knowing even as he spoke how inadequate it sounded. "Reviews?" Jefferson repeated, the word carrying a weight of skepticism. "Yes, I see those here. Perfunctory investigations that seemed more concerned with protecting the department from liability than addressing underlying issues." He selected another document. "Here's one from 3 years ago, a complaint filed by a college professor who was stopped and searched while walking to his evening class. The investigation concluded there was insufficient evidence of misconduct, despite 3 witness statements corroborating his account." Carter remembered that incident, though he'd dismissed it from his mind almost immediately after being cleared. Seeing it now, through the lens of today's events, cast it in a very different light. "Sir," he began, but Jefferson held up a hand. "Before you speak, I want you to understand something. What happened today in the park wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was the inevitable result of a system that has consistently validated your worst instincts while ignoring the harm they cause." Jefferson stood, moving to the window. Below, a group of protesters had begun to gather, their signs visible even from this height. "Look at them," he said, gesturing to the growing crowd. "Each person down there represents countless others who have experienced what I experienced today, but who didn't have the authority or platform to make their voices heard." He turned back to Carter, his expression firm but not unkind. "You know what the truly tragic part is? I believe you genuinely think you've been doing your job well. That's what happens when a system rewards the wrong behaviors for too long. It warps our understanding of right and wrong, of service and authority." Jefferson returned to his desk, picking up a thin folder that Carter hadn't noticed before. "This," he said, holding it up, "is my own personal record of similar encounters. Times when I, as a civilian, was stopped, questioned, or detained by officers who looked at me and saw a threat rather than a citizen they were sworn to protect." He placed the folder on the desk between them. "Would you like to know how many incidents are documented here?" Carter found himself nodding, though part of him dreaded the answer. 27, Jefferson said quietly. 27 times in my life before becoming chief that I was subjected to the kind of treatment you showed me today. The only difference is, those other times, I couldn't reveal my credentials to force accountability." He opened the folder, revealing meticulously documented incidents, complete with dates, times, and officer names. Each of these represents a failure of training, of judgment, of basic human dignity. But more than that, they represent missed opportunities for growth and change. Outside the office, the regular activities of the precinct continued, but muted, as if the entire department was holding its breath. Through the glass walls, Carter could see officers trying to appear busy while stealing glances at the chief's office. "I want you to understand something, Officer Carter," Jefferson continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "I didn't accept this position just to punish officers who abuse their authority. I took it because I believe in the possibility of change. Real change. Not just policy modifications or sensitivity training sessions, but fundamental transformation in how we approach our role in the community." He stood again, this time moving to a framed photograph on the wall. A black and white image of what appeared to be his father in a police uniform from decades ago. "My father was one of the first black officers in this city's police force. He faced discrimination from both sides, from the community that didn't trust a black man in uniform and from fellow officers who didn't trust him at all. But he persevered because he believed that change had to come from within." Turning back to Carter, Jefferson's expression carried both authority and compassion. "He taught me that true authority comes not from a badge or a gun, but from the trust we build with the communities we serve. Today, Officer Carter, you showed me, and the world, exactly why that trust has been broken." Carter felt the weight of each word, each revelation. The chief's personal history added layers of meaning to their encounter in the park, making his composed handling of the situation even more remarkable. "Sir," Carter managed to speak, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I don't know what to say." "Good," Jefferson replied, sitting back down. "That means you're finally starting to listen. For too long, officers like you have been doing all the talking, making all the assumptions, controlling all the narratives. Maybe it's time for a different approach." He pulled out a form from his desk drawer, a document Carter recognized as a disciplinary action notice. "Now, we have decisions to make. Your actions today have left me with several options, none of them easy. I could terminate your employment immediately. The public would certainly support that decision. I could suspend you pending an investigation, though we both know what that investigation would find." Jefferson paused, studying Carter's face. "Or I could offer you something else entirely. A chance to be part of the solution rather than continuing to be part of the problem. But that path won't be easy. It will require you to confront your biases, acknowledge your mistakes, and commit to genuine change." The choice hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and peril. Through the windows, Carter could see the sun beginning to set, casting long shadows across the office. The day that had started so normally was ending with everything he thought he knew about himself and his role as an officer in question. "The decision is yours, Officer Carter," Jefferson said, his voice carrying both authority and opportunity. "But understand this. Whatever you choose, things cannot and will not continue as they have been. The only question is whether you'll be part of the change or another example of why it's necessary." The Administrative Review boardroom felt cavernous despite its modest size, its wood-paneled walls seeming to absorb the afternoon light filtering through Venetian blinds. Carter sat alone at the long table, the empty chairs around him a reminder of the isolation his actions had created. Before him lay a stack of papers, civilian complaints, incident reports, and performance reviews spanning his 15-year career. Each document told a story he was only now beginning to truly read. Chief Jefferson had given him these files hours ago, with simple instructions. Read them all, not as the officer who wrote them, but as the citizens who lived them. Now, as Carter turned each page, faces emerged from the sterile police language. A teenage boy stopped while walking home from basketball practice, an elderly man questioned while waiting for a bus, a woman detained while trying to enter her own home. The door opened quietly, and Officer Sarah Chen entered, carrying a cup of coffee. She hesitated before approaching, her usual easy manner replaced by professional distance. "Thought you might need this," she said, placing the cup near him. Carter noticed she chose a spot just out of arm's reach, a small but telling detail. "Thanks," he managed, his voice rough from hours of silence. Chen lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say more, then turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "You know, Carter," she said without turning around, "I always looked up to you when I first joined the force. Thought you were what a real cop should be." The words hung in the air between them. "It makes me wonder what else I've been wrong about." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Carter alone again with his thoughts and the growing weight of realization. He reached for the next file in the stack, recognizing the date immediately, March 15th, 2022. The incident had seemed so justified at the time, a suspicious individual photographing buildings downtown. The man had turned out to be an architectural student working on his thesis. Carter remembered how he'd dismissed the student's complaint about racial profiling, how his sergeant had backed him up without question, how the whole thing had been buried under paperwork and procedure. Reading it now, he saw what he'd missed then. The student's fear masked as defiance, the way the system had worked to protect Carter rather than serve justice. Through the room's windows, he could see the department's daily activities continuing. Officers moved through their routines, but there was a different energy now, a self-consciousness in their interactions with the public. News of his encounter with Chief Jefferson had spread through the ranks like wildfire, forcing everyone to examine their own conduct through a new lens. Sergeant Phillips walked past the window, catching Carter's eye briefly before looking away. The same man who had dismissed countless civilian complaints against Carter now couldn't meet his gaze. The shift in dynamics was palpable. Carter had become a cautionary tale, his actions a mirror forcing others to confront their own potential for abuse of power. He turned to another file, this one from just 6 months ago. A woman had filed a complaint about being aggressively questioned while walking her dog in an upscale neighborhood. Carter had justified the stop by citing a series of recent burglaries in the area, but reading his report now, he couldn't find a single concrete reason for his suspicion beyond the color of her skin. The coffee Chen had brought grew cold, untouched, as Carter continued through the files. Each report, each complaint, each dismissed investigation added another layer to his understanding of how deeply rooted his biases had become. The professional language he'd used appeared suspicious, matched a description, exhibited nervous behavior, now read like a lexicon of prejudice, a code for justifying unwarranted stops and searches. A commotion outside drew his attention. Through the window, he saw a group of officers gathered around a computer, watching what appeared to be news coverage. The incident in the park had gone viral, with multiple videos showing different angles of his encounter with Chief Jefferson. Carter watched his colleagues' reactions, the grimaces, the headshakes, the uncomfortable shifting. They were seeing what he was finally seeing, the ugly truth behind what they'd all considered good police work. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the files before him, when Chief Jefferson entered the room. He carried himself with the same quiet dignity he'd shown in the park, though now Carter could see the weight of experience behind that composure. The 27 documented incidents in the chief's personal files suddenly feeling more real than ever. "Have you finished reviewing the files?" Jefferson asked, taking a seat across from Carter. "Yes, sir," Carter replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I never saw them this way before." Jefferson nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's often the problem with perspective, Officer Carter. We don't see what we're not ready to acknowledge." He gestured to the stack of files. "Each of these represents a moment when you had a choice, a moment when you could have chosen to see the person in front of you as a citizen deserving of respect, rather than a suspect deserving of suspicion." Through the window, more officers had gathered around the computer. Someone had found another video of the park incident, this one showing Carter's approach from a different angle. Watching his colleagues' reactions, Carter saw his own journey of realization reflected in their faces. "You know what strikes me about these reports?" Jefferson continued, selecting one from the stack. "The consistency of the language." A subject became confrontational when questioned. Individual displayed suspicious behavior. Suspect refused to comply with simple requests. "It's as if we've developed an entire vocabulary to justify our prejudices." Carter thought about all the times he'd used those same phrases, how they'd become a shield against accountability. "I never thought about how it looked from their side," he admitted. "No," Jefferson agreed. "You didn't. But now you have to. Because that's what real change requires, the ability to see beyond our own perspective, to understand the impact of our actions on others." He paused, studying Carter's face. "The question is, what will you do with this understanding?" The room fell silent save for the distant sounds of the precinct and the soft hum of the building's heating system. Carter looked at the files spread before him, each one a testament to moments when he'd failed to live up to his oath to protect and serve all citizens equally. "I've already scheduled a department-wide training session for tomorrow," Jefferson announced, standing. "Your encounter with me in the park will be used as a case study. Every officer will watch those videos, will see how easily authority can become abuse, how quickly prejudice can masquerade as procedure." He moved to the window, watching the gathering of officers below. But more importantly, they'll see what happens when that prejudice is confronted by someone who refuses to be intimidated, who knows their rights, and who has the authority to demand accountability. He turned back to Carter. "Not everyone has that authority, Officer Carter. That's why those who carry a badge must be held to a higher standard." The last rays of sunlight painted the room in amber hues, the shadows of the files stretching across the table like accusations. Carter realized that this moment, this reckoning, was just the beginning. The real test would be what came next, how he chose to move forward with the understanding he'd gained. "The department will be watching," Jefferson said, moving toward the door. "They'll be looking to see if real change is possible, if an officer who's been part of the problem can become part of the solution." He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "The choice is yours, Officer Carter. But whatever you decide, know that things cannot and will not go back to the way they were." 3 months after the park incident, the precinct had undergone a transformation that went far beyond new policies and procedures. The physical changes were obvious. The walls now displayed community engagement photos alongside traditional police memorabilia. The bulletin boards featured civilian feedback and transparency metrics, and the once intimidating front desk had been redesigned to be more welcoming. But the real changes ran deeper, touching the very culture of the department. Carter stood before a group of cadets in the department's training room, the same videos that had gone viral playing on the screen behind him. He no longer flinched when watching himself in those moments. The confrontation, the handcuffing, the revelation. Instead, he used every frame as a teaching tool, a stark reminder of how quickly authority could corrupt and how easily bias could masquerade as intuition. "What you're watching," he told the fresh faces before him, "isn't just one officer's mistake. It's the result of a system that allowed prejudice to hide behind procedure, that confused control with protection, that forgot the serve in protect and serve." The cadets watched intently, many taking notes, all of them aware that they were witnessing something rare. A veteran officer publicly acknowledging and learning from his failures. Chief Jefferson stood at the back of the room, observing quietly. In the months since the incident, he had systematically reshaped the department's approach to community policing, using Carter's experience as a catalyst for change. The transformation hadn't been easy. Several officers had resigned rather than adapt to the new standards, while others had initially resisted what they saw as an attack on traditional policing methods. But Carter had surprised everyone, including himself, by becoming one of the strongest advocates for reform. His journey from resistant veteran to champion of change had given hope to officers struggling with their own biases and assumptions. More importantly, it had shown the community that real transformation was possible, even in those they had given up on. "Look at my body language here," Carter continued, freezing the video on a frame where he approached Chief Jefferson on the park bench. "See how I'm positioned. Everything about my stance communicates threat rather than service. I'm not approaching a citizen. I'm advancing on what I've already decided is a suspect." A young cadet raised her hand. "But sir, weren't you just following your training? We're taught to maintain tactical advantage, to control the situation." Carter nodded, appreciating the question. "That's exactly the kind of thinking I use to justify my actions. But ask yourself, control for what purpose? Safety is essential, yes. But look at this scene again. What actual threat was present? What crime was being committed? Or was I simply responding to my own biases, creating danger where none existed?" The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Through the windows, Carter could see regular patrol officers pausing to listen, drawn by the honest self-reflection they rarely heard from their colleagues. Some nodded in recognition, perhaps seeing their own behaviors mirrored in his words. "The hardest part," Carter continued, advancing to another frame in the video, "wasn't facing disciplinary action or public criticism. It was confronting the truth about myself, about how many lives I'd impacted, how many citizens I'd failed to serve properly, how many times I'd hidden behind my badge rather than honor what it represents." Chief Jefferson moved forward now, joining Carter at the front of the room. The two men stood side by side, their presence together a powerful symbol of the department's commitment to change. The chief's calm authority complemented Carter's raw honesty, creating a dynamic that commanded attention and respect. "Officer Carter's journey," Jefferson addressed the cadets, "is not unique. Every one of you will face moments where your assumptions and biases try to override your training and oath. The question is, will you have the courage to recognize those moments? Will you choose to serve rather than subjugate, to protect rather than intimidate?" After the training session, Carter walked through the precinct, noticing the subtle but significant changes in how officers interacted with civilians. The aggressive stance and authoritative tone that had once been standard had been replaced by something more professional, more respectful. Even the language had changed. Suspects became individuals, confrontations became encounters, each shift in terminology reflecting a deeper change in perspective. He paused at his desk, now positioned near the community liaison office, a deliberate placement that reminded him daily of his new role as a bridge between the department and the public. The wall beside his desk displayed thank you letters from citizens he'd helped since the incident, each one a testament to the possibility of change. "Officer Carter," a familiar voice called. He turned to see Mrs. Thompson, the teacher who had witnessed the park incident, standing in the precinct doorway. She'd become a regular presence at community policing meetings, initially skeptical, but gradually warming to the department's efforts at reform. "Mrs. Thompson," he greeted her, noting how different this interaction felt from their encounters before the incident. "Here for the Community Advisory Board meeting?" She nodded, adjusting her reading glasses. "And to share some good news. The school board approved our proposal for the police student mentorship program. We'll be starting next month, assuming you're still willing to help coordinate." Carter felt a surge of pride mixed with humility. The program had been his idea, born from his recognition that breaking down barriers between law enforcement and the community had to start early. "Absolutely," he replied. "Chief Jefferson has already approved the schedule adjustments for officers who volunteered." As they walked toward the meeting room, they passed the wall where Carter's disciplinary report from the park incident hung framed, not as a punishment, but as a reminder. Beside it was a series of photographs showing the department's progress. Officers at community events, youth outreach programs, citizen police academies where transparency and accountability were taught alongside procedure. The Community Advisory Board meeting exemplified the new approach. Citizens and officers sat together, discussing concerns and solutions as equals. Carter watched as rookie officers who had once been anxious about such interactions now engaged confidently with community members, their training under the new policies evident in their approach. Chief Jefferson entered last, carrying the latest community feedback reports. The statistics showed a marked decrease in civilian complaints and use of force incidents, alongside an increase in positive community interactions and successful conflict resolution without arrests. 3 months ago, Jefferson began, addressing the mixed group of officers and civilians, this department faced a turning point. We could have treated Officer Carter's actions in the park as an isolated incident, dealt with it through traditional disciplinary measures, and moved on. Instead, we chose to see it as an opportunity for systematic change. Carter felt the weight of every eye in the room, but it no longer brought shame. Instead, he felt responsibility to continue growing, to help others learn from his mistakes, to prove that law enforcement could evolve without losing its effectiveness. The real measure of our progress, Jefferson continued, isn't in these statistics, though they're encouraging. It's in the daily interactions between officers and citizens. It's in the questions our officers now ask themselves before taking action. It's in the trust we're rebuilding, step by step, encounter by encounter. As the meeting proceeded, Carter reflected on his journey. The officer who had approached a man on a park bench out of unfounded suspicion seemed like a stranger now. Yet remembering him was crucial to preventing backsliding into old habits. His transformation hadn't erased his past actions, but it had given them purpose, as lessons, as warnings, as proof that change was possible. The sun was setting as the meeting concluded, casting long shadows through the precinct windows. Carter gathered his materials, including the updated community engagement protocols he'd helped develop. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to either reinforce old prejudices or build new understanding. But now, every decision would be made with awareness, every action taken with consciousness of its broader impact. As he prepared to head out for his evening patrol, Chief Jefferson stopped him. "You know, Carter," he said, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had that day in the park, "when I took this position, I hoped to create lasting change. What I've learned is that real change doesn't come from policies or procedures alone. It comes from officers like you, willing to confront their mistakes and work to be better." Carter nodded, understanding the responsibility those words carried. As he stepped out into the evening, his badge caught the last rays of sunlight. Its weight felt different now, not as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of service, of the constant choice between power and protection, between control and care. 1 year after the park incident, the city's police department had become a model for reform across the country. News crews that had once gathered to document controversy now came to study success, and departments from other states regularly sent observers to learn from what many called the Jefferson-Carter model of community policing. Carter stood at a podium in the National Law Enforcement Conference, the same videos from the park playing behind him. But now they were part of a larger story. The audience, police chiefs, community leaders, and reform advocates from across the nation listened intently as he shared not just what had happened that day, but the systematic changes that followed. "The easiest thing," Carter told them, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "would have been to treat this as an isolated incident. Fire the problem officer, me, make some public statements about zero tolerance, and move on." Chief Jefferson chose a harder path. He saw an opportunity not just to punish misconduct, but to transform an entire department's culture. In the front row, Jefferson sat with a group of community leaders from their city, Mrs. Thompson from the school board, Mr. Rodriguez from the Hispanic Business Association, and Reverend Matthews from the Interfaith Council. They were no longer just observers of law enforcement, but active partners in public safety. The department's statistics told a compelling story. Civilian complaints down 70%, successful conflict resolution up 60%, and community trust metrics at historic highs. But the real changes were visible in the daily interactions between officers and citizens. The easy conversations, the mutual respect, the sense of shared purpose. What happened in that park wasn't the end of my career, Carter continued, though at the time, I thought it would be. Instead, it was the beginning of something far more important, a genuine transformation in how we approach our role as peace officers. We learned that true authority comes not from how much power we exercise, but from how wisely we choose not to use it. As he concluded his speech, Carter caught Jefferson's eye. The chief gave him a slight nod, the same calm, dignified gesture he'd shown that day in the park. But now it carried a different meaning, speaking not of authority challenged, but of wisdom shared, of lessons learned, of progress earned through honest self-reflection and dedicated work. The sun set over the conference center, its rays catching the badges of hundreds of officers from across the nation. Each pinpoint of light represented a choice, to remain entrenched in old ways or to embrace the challenging but essential work of change. The story that began with one officer's biased assumptions had become a beacon, lighting the way toward a new model of policing, where authority and empathy, power and protection, service and safety could finally exist in balance. Carter gathered his materials as the audience rose for a standing ovation. But he knew the real work continued beyond these moments of recognition. Tomorrow, he would return to his community, where every interaction offered a chance to prove that change was not just possible, but sustainable. That trust once broken could be rebuilt, and that those who carry a badge could learn to carry wisdom as well. The papers in his briefcase included plans for expanding their youth mentorship program, proposals for new community oversight mechanisms, and data from their latest transparency initiatives. But more importantly, they carried the stories of countless small victories, moments when officers chose understanding over confrontation, when communities chose trust over suspicion, when the divide between protector and protected began to heal. As the conference hall emptied, Jefferson joined him at the podium. "You know," the chief said, straightening his tie in that familiar, deliberate way. "That day in the park, I saw two possible futures. One where an incident became an excuse for further division, and one where it became a catalyst for real change. You helped make the better future possible." Carter nodded, understanding that their work was both finished and ongoing, each day bringing new challenges, new opportunities to either reinforce old barriers or build new bridges. The story that began with confrontation had evolved into collaboration, but its lessons would need to be learned and relearned by each new generation of officers who chose to serve and protect. Outside, the city lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, each one representing a community waiting to see if the promise of reform could become a lasting reality. The badge on Carter's chest caught the last light of day, its meaning transformed by time and truth. No longer a shield behind which to hide, but a symbol of the continuous choice to serve with wisdom, protect with compassion, and lead with understanding.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.